Scramble by I Had Him on the Ropes, Carter Reed, and Rory Gone Maddie, roasted to days. Chapter 13, Day 959. Wayne Manor was always beautiful in the first gasps of summer. Still wiping the lingering sleep of spring from its eyes, the house lingered in the heady in-between season. It was eager to show its enjoyment of the winds that pulled in the tang of ozone and a faint trace of garlic from the nearby woods that often warned of a storm the bright blue skies hid from sight by throwing its windows open wide. The gardens, too, bloomed shade brighter, sprawling over the boundaries that once had been well maintained. Bruce had little concern upon his return to Gotham at keeping the lawn kept at right angles when the underbelly of his city society clamored like war drums against his ears. He was grateful for that now, of course, when he could see tangled flowers stretching tall and wide, and the after-image of Dick cartwheeling his way towards the house, clothes askew and smeared with dirt, a half-mangled giant sunflower in his hand, clutching at what few petals had survived his son's acrobatics. His child, with a blinding smile eclipsing his face, had warmed Bruce from his cold heart out into his chest, until places he didn't know he had hummed in contentment, and the grounds remained a jungle for young minds to enjoy exploration and pull on broad-brimmed hats and call themselves adventurers. Bedraggled, yes, but thriving beneath a wide Gotham sky. Bruce could already taste the day on his tongue before he blinked open his eyes late the next morning. He had foregone patrol, instead investing his hours in coding and important paperwork for WE, but still his body complained. It groaned as he moved, muscles rippling beneath his skin before jarring to an abrupt and searing stop, reminding him once again that his days beneath the cowl were numbered. He pushed one hand through his hair while the other tracked south, coming to rest on the scar spanning his ribs. It was old, long since turned white before his eyes, and in fact new scars wrapped their way over top, leaving the decision he made years ago as nothing more than another footnote in the history of his pain. He had never regretted his decision to remove the words, not that such an act erased the memory of them. He could still trace the letters, and knew his fingers, after so many years, often moved of their own accord. Yet yesterday had been testing. A horrid mix of anger, retribution, satisfaction, and overwhelming sadness had burned his veins, because while he still looked at Clark and saw the soft-hearted man who blushed prettily and urged him to rest and "Take some time, Bee. I don't want to see you hurt," he had also meant what he said. The path they were on had been started by Clark, and it was a path they were now destined to walk until fate intervened again. He pushed back the sheets and let out a little huff of breath at the protest in his back, thumbs coming to ease the tightness there before shuffling his way first to the bathroom and then, after pulling on a t-shirt, downstairs. There was a clattering in the kitchen that was a little louder than usual, which suggested either Alfred was upset or distracted. If their brief half-conversation the previous day was any indications, Bruce would bet his fortune on the latter. The Brit had furrowed his brows at the offhand. "Clark knows I'm Batman," Bruce had thrown over his shoulder before disappearing into the cave to code. The man had clearly stewed in silence before, several hours later emerging with a pot of tea, plate of biscuits, and a tired smile. "Did you tell him he was an idiot, Master Wayne?" "I did." Another smile, this one brighter, and bleeding love and acceptance. Then, "That's my boy." Bruce had cocked an eye at that, smiling himself, and opened his mouth to reply, but the older man had already turned and begun to retreat back up into the manor. The fridge door had been left open, and the small TV set on the counter was on, chattering about proposed reforms to the Gotham's DA office in an effort to root out corruption, and Bruce found himself a little too distracted by it if the collision with the door was any indication. Bruce groaned softly, lips parted in quiet admission of yet more pain as the handle dug cruelly into a particularly tender bruise lingering from a patrol several days previously. "Ow," he muttered, rubbing his side. "A little warning would have been nice," he continued, shutting the door and finally looking up at the figure sat at his kitchen island. And froze. He was sure his mouth was a little agape, his lip drooping, while his heart had picked up a jump rope and began bouncing around inside his chest. The organ flew into his throat before plummeting down into his stomach, tugging violently at any tissue it could find, giving him the sudden and overpowering urge to drive. Hi. There was something wrong with his voice. It was too breathy and a little pitchy, too. The words strained against the insides of his mouth, eager, but then fell flat. Lead weights hanging on the edge of his tongue, mocking him with silence. Hey, Bruce? Dick replied, awkward, spoon filled with milk and cereal, paused halfway to his lips, eyes serious and calm. You look terrible, he added, taking a bite. Here. The billionaire managed to choke out, taking the opportunity to assess his son for injuries. Bloodhaven was not kind to police officers, and despite a considerably more lax media focus in recent years, Dick was still his son, and the world knew it. Luckily, Nightwing had been trained enough to save himself from those who sought to ransom him back to his billionaire guardian. There was, however, a bruise on the side of his son's cheek far enough below his eye for Bruce to know he'd dodged the punch, but had been taking on enough assailants that a dodge had been enough to prevent injury. Dick caught the focus of his attention and shrugged. You're worse, he said before pausing and adding, Alfred called us. Ah, well, that sounded distinctly like... Wait... Us? Dick corked a lip and offered a one-shouldered shrug, pushing the spoon into his mouth and jerking his hand to the other figure Bruce hadn't noticed, who was slouching in his chair, feet on the table, and a mug of coffee teetering dangerously in his hand, soft snores punctuating his breaths. An after-image of years ago, with two boys insisting they stay up until daybreak and watch the sun rise over their city, tumbling into sleep before the first rays had even cracked the horizon, flickered behind Bruce's eyes. Jason? Bruce breathed out like a prayer, eyes dragging back and forth between his sons before shaking his head as though to clear his thoughts. How? Why? He swallowed thickly. Alfred? Dick smiled gently, eyes suddenly dropping down to his cereal while he pushed the remnants around with his spoon. He called late last night? Or early this morning, I'm not sure. He called to say that the Batman's identity had been exposed. The Superman knew who you were beneath the cowl. He began slowly. He was worried. About you, and about us. If Superman knew you, then... It might connect the dots and discover you, too. Bruce finished, panic seeping into his bones because he hadn't even considered that. Dick glanced up. Alfred just wanted to warn us to not panic if we had a visitor. There was a pregnant pause. He also said you could, do with family around, too. Dick's expression faltered for a moment. We can go. This is... No. Bruce spluttered, stepping forward before catching himself. No, please. He swallowed again, attempting to ease the faltering tone, breaking his speech. Please don't leave. The billionaire drew in a deep breath. I just didn't think you'd be... We parted on bad terms. I thought... That we were never going to come back? Dick finished, eyebrow creeping north. He shrugged again. We're family, Bruce. Always. We were always going to come home, eventually. The billionaire's heart was racing in his chest, one beat blurring into the next until it felt like a hummingbird was thrumming inside him. A galloping, desperate, eager thud running on a hope that had begun to take root beneath his ribs. Of course, he nodded, voice soft and vulnerable, gaze going back towards Jason. He's had a long morning, Dick excused with a smile. He's not hurt, is he? Bruce asked, looking for injuries beneath the flap of hair and the baggy jumper. Dick laughed, rolling his eyes and lightening the mood in an instant, something familiar and mysterious lingering there. No, not that kind of morning. The young man hesitated, clearly reining in his laughter. When we arrived, Alfred explained the situation to us in a bit more detail. About you and Superman being you were Superman? And about the monumental calamity that is your... He paused. Honestly, I don't know what you two are. He huffed, brow furrowing quickly before a smile quickly replaced it. We were upset about it, obviously, about Superman's prejudice. But you know Jason, he doesn't exactly follow orders. He took offense to Superman's reaction and, well, he went to see Clark. At Bruce's sudden and shocked expression, Dick winced, clearly catching on to his alarm. Alfred told us who he was so we could be prepared for anything. I mean, if you're expecting an alien in tights, then a reporter in glasses can kind of slip through the cracks. Bruce groaned softly, sitting down with a thud on the bar stool pushed up against their breakfast bar. What happened? Well, Jason might have, hypothetically, broken into the cave, stolen a kryptonite ring, tracked Clark down, walked into the Daily Planet offices, marched over to Clark's desk, punched Clark in the face, and then stormed out again. Horror! He didn't. Of course I did! A new voice chimed in late with sleep. The fucker deserved it! Jason blinked up at Bruce from beneath his lashes, a slow and devious sort of smile creeping across his face. He seemed relaxed and more than a little smug, a combination that both amused Bruce and took him back years to when they stood at the end of the manor staircase and shouted at each other before sharing ice cream and a movie and apology. It was jarring but also exceedingly welcome after the calamity of recent months. The only people allowed to mess you up are us, Jason snorted, jabbing a thumb into his own chest. And Alfred. His grin then changed into a feral sort of thing. It was more fun than I expected. Punching my soulmate or punching Superman? Bruce clarified dryly, voice barely concealing the amusement and joy at his son being so defensive of him, a hope that this could be a fresh start, a new chapter in their lives. Both, Jason said. At first I thought, what a jerk. Then I thought, honestly, Bruce, whatever he said or did couldn't have been worse than what I've done, and you forgave me. Then... Oh no, that's the end. I just wanted to punch him in the face. Oh my God, Dick snorted in the background. Although, Jason continued, standing and setting his mug down on the counter before rooting through his pocket and pulling out a packet of cigarettes, I haven't picked a pretty girl over you before. And I haven't fallen in love with Batman either, he added, lighting up and taking a drag, ignoring the glare from Bruce at his actions. So I guess I'm back to my first thought again. Superman is a jerk. The kitchen fell silent, each of the three men just looking at each other. Then, Master Jason, while it is most wonderful to have you back, it is decidedly less wonderful living inside a bonfire, came Alfred's voice from the pantry. The older man walked in, a deliberate and long look at the cigarette dangling from between Jason's fingers, and remained unmoving until the former Robin stubbed it out on the worktop. Thank you, he said with a smile, which caused Jason to grimace back. Dick barked out a laugh, and even Bruce grinned. And look at that, Alfred said. 6 months without a smile, and 10 minutes with you boys, and he's beaming like a pageant queen. The Brit clapped his hands together. And that, gentlemen, is cause for celebratory pancakes. I've eaten, Jason chimed in. Coffee and half a cigarette is not breakfast, Alfred replied, steamrolling over the excuse in an instant. Master Bruce is on pancake duty, Master Dick can squeeze the orange juice, and you, Master Jason, can dice the fruit for our fruit salad. What are you doing? Jason asked, watching as Alfred sat, unfolded the Gotham Gazette, and settled in to read. The butler looked up from over his reading glasses and smiled. I'm supervising, he replied. And that was that. It was stilted. Of course it was. It had been years since the four of them had occupied the same space, let alone shared a meal or anything particularly personal. Yet the longer the boys stayed, the more the warmth in Bruce's chest began to spread, and the more he trusted their promise that we'll be better at keeping in touch this time. Like the past was nothing more than forgetfulness and missed messages. Not that Bruce cared. If it wrote over his mistakes and brought his sons back into his orbit, he'd take any way they intended to move beyond the disaster that had been Jason's death. It was the evening, though, when the day threw Bruce another emotional curveball. Jason, claiming fatigue and probably a little sour at Alfred continually confiscating his cigarettes, had retreated to his room an hour previously, while Dick had curled up in front of the fire under a blanket with a pile of papers he had to finish for work. Bruce joined him, deciding to finish up a few things for Fox, while Alfred sat reading in the old wingback armchair, enjoying a novel from what appeared to be the Regency era. The chime of the doorbell was unexpected, but Bruce didn't need superpowers to know who it would be. He sighed, shaking his head at the offer of Dick to get the door and ignoring the worried glance from Alfred before making his way into the entrance hall. A flick of the lock and... Bruce! Clark greeted, eyes nervously flitting around, never settling on anything for too long. The older man heaved out a breath before stepping to the side and letting the Kryptonian in. As much as he might want to, leaving Clark on the doorstep was neither productive nor positive for either of their civilian identities.
"What are you doing here, Cal?"
Bruce asked, shutting the door and taking a step back, arms immediately crossing themselves in front of his chest. Clark winced, hands wringing. He looked terrible. Between his pale complexion, general expression, and the rumpled nature of his appearance, it looked like he'd spent most of his time since their meeting worrying his hair and clenching his shirt up inside a fist.
"I wanted to talk," he confessed quietly.
"We have talked," Bruce countered, not giving an inch.
"I'd like to talk more,"
Clark shot back just as quickly.
10 minutes?
He asked, hands suddenly spread wide as though in surrender. "You all right, Bruce?" Dick's voice said, carrying through the hall and making the billionaire turn. It was steely, and again a sense of gratitude bloomed inside him at the presence of his eldest.
"I'm all right, thanks, Dick,"
he replied kindly.
"It's okay,"
he added with a nod when, unconvinced, Dick turned to glare at Clark. "My brother and I have access to more kryptonite than the ring that knocked you on your ass earlier, alien," he said, toned flat and lethal.
"Dick,
don't make us use it," he finished.
"Master Dick,"
Alfred said, attempting at being rebuking, but with amusement and pride listing his tone, it was doomed from the beginning. He appeared in the doorway, hands folded in front of him.
"I quite think your father and Mr. Kent need a moment."
"Dick, I'm fine. Thank you," Bruce said warmly.
"Finish your paperwork,"
he urged. The young man narrowed his eyes before turning on his heel and disappearing from view. Alfred chuckled.
"I'll keep Master Dick and Master Jason out of the way for a little while,"
he promised before he too vanished from sight. Bruce turned back to Clark, a little amused at the blatant shock on his face.
10 minutes,
he agreed, jerking his head towards the small servant's kitchen that was only ever used as a pantry nowadays.
"Father?"
Clark asked after falling into step beside him.
"Yes,"
Bruce replied.
"Dick?"
he asked, eyebrow carked a question there.
"Richard,"
he clarified.
Sit,"
Bruce ordered, turning to the fridge and pulling out 2 beers because this was going to need more than a cup of tea. He pushed one across the table to Clark, who thanked him with a nod before taking a seat himself.
"He said brother,"
Clark began.
"Jason,"
Bruce clarified.
"You didn't mention them." "We lost Jason a few years ago. I didn't react well and I pushed Dick away. When we got Jason back, I never rebuilt the bridge,"
he explained.
"Lost?"
Clark murmured, confusion lacing his tone.
"Jason died, Cal."
"But..." Bruce croaked out a laugh.
"There's more mystery in this world than you, Cal,"
he huffed, taking a sip.
"I'm sorry,"
Clark muttered. Bruce struggled.
"Clark, stop. I don't need you to say you're sorry 100 times. No more apologies."
His teeth slammed together with an audible clack, and he blushed a deep red. Instead, he shrugged and took a drink of his beer.
"I'm still in love with you. You know that, right?"
he offered after a moment.
"I had my suspicions,"
he said, tone slow and cautious.
"World's greatest detective," Cal mumbled. "And I meant what I said on the rooftop. When I met Batman, everything just clicked."
He paused.
"Maybe Batman's my soulmate."
Bruce frowned.
"You know it doesn't work like that, Cal."
"I know," he huffed, annoyed, before his features softened, tone transforming into something desperate and sad.
"But... he's you! You know that! Brucey isn't you underneath, right? Can you really hate me for falling in love with the real you rather than the facade?"
Clark suddenly looked so young as he glanced up at Bruce from beneath his lashes.
"I don't hate you, Cal,"
Bruce countered, swallowing thickly.
"I never hated you, not really."
He paused.
"But look at this from my point of view. You told me about what your mother said about your soulmate being the first person you saved. Did you ever stop to consider why they needed saving in the first place?
Clark cut himself off, confused again.
Look at my life,
Bruce continued.
My parents are dead. Their murder was never avenged. I spent years in the bowels of a mountain learning how to be more than a man. I've been shot, stabbed, spat at, poisoned, burned, and beaten. I've lost a son and I've ostracized another. I've had barely one successful relationship, and I avoid personal connection. I've been used and objectified, and I've let it happen, because I knew that it was for the good of the mission. The mission is all I've really known. I let myself have the fairy tale, the myth of being saved, because I was convinced it would never be. Then there it was, then it was gone, and I learned that my life must be the mission. Always the mission. I'm beyond saving now, Clark, and I've accepted that. But wouldn't you be just as angry as I to be offered salvation, only to be told you don't deserve it?
There was a long, heavy, loaded silence filled only with Bruce taking a drink.
Can I see?
Clark finally whispered, glancing down towards his ribs. Bruce paused, face moving from impassive to incredulous.
There's nothing there, Clark,
he replied, tone slow. Not! The alien cut himself off, horror and panic bleeding into his features.
You burnt them off,
you remembered.
I burnt them off,
Bruce affirmed. He stopped, features turning determined.
I want to make this right.
Bruce scowled.
You know it doesn't work like that, Cal,
he echoed.
I love you,
Clark said, as though that solved everything.
I love the stupid way you scowl at Barry, and the way you try not to roll your eyes when one of us suggests something stupid. I love the way your mind works, the way you are always 15 steps ahead, but never make us feel small. Unless we're being idiots and we deserve it.
He laughed quickly.
I love the way you always think of others before yourself. I love the way you are kind and generous and know the value of little things. I love your smile, both the little one you used to give me and the big stony one that happens when you just can't catch yourself in time. I love your wit and your stupid puns and the way you drop jokes when I'm down. I love the way you're dedicated to good and to helping people, but I hate the way you don't care enough to take care of yourself. You deserve the world, B, and you deserve better than me, I know that. I know I've messed up and said and done things I can't take back. I know that I'm nowhere near good enough for you, but I want to try and be better. I want to make sure you know every day that your soul is so beautiful, it's blinding. I want to spend my life making it up to you, B. I want to love you for the rest of my days. I will love you for the rest of my days. But I'd love it if you'd let me love you.
Clark, Bruce exhaled in one long breath.
Why not?
We're walking different paths. Maybe in another universe, in another lifetime, but I don't think it's possible in this one.
Why not?
Clark breathed, hand tentatively reaching forward to rest on Bruce's.
Why can't I just change paths?
Why would you want to?
Why would I not? He retorted. I love you. I have since I first landed on that Gotham roof years ago. It just took a little time for my head to get around it.
There's a lot of history that can't just be forgotten, Cal.
There were tears beating in the corner of his eyes, but he was being valiant in not letting them fall.
I'm not,
he huffed.
Trial run,
he offered. Bruce frowned, ignoring the fact he hadn't yet pulled back his hand, and instead met the inquiring gaze of the Kryptonian.
What?
We start over completely and we rebuild everything. Start as strangers and see if we can be friends again. You make the decision. If yes, then...
He broke off, face expressing every hope he had.
And if no, then we stay friends. I'll never bring any of this up again, and we'll just be two guys who hang out and watch a football game every now and again.
We tried that before,
Bruce murmured soft.
Bruce,
what if I say no, right now? Then we would only ever be friends at the most. Would you accept that?
Yes,
Then
if you can look me in the eyes and tell me that deep down you don't love me.
The alien finished. Bruce shook his head incredulous and let out a laugh at the sheer stubbornness of his soulmates.
I don't want to love you, and I don't want you to love me either,
he finally offered. Pete!
This isn't healthy, Cal,
he murmured, finally pulling his hand away, missing the warmth instantly. I know, Clark conceded. I wanted to do the right thing, to be good. But every time I thought I could, something got in the way. I was so jealous about you and Arthur, and then you and, well, yourself, that I never really let myself understand your side. He trailed off. I didn't understand why I loved you so much. Bruce was left with the image of his soulmate, his idiot, morally superior, frightened, desperate, jealous, good-hearted, judgmental, prejudiced, loving soulmate. But even still, his idiot. After all, if there was nothing, he still wouldn't be this affected.
I don't know where this leaves us, Cal.
The Kryptonian shrugged. It leaves us where you want to leave us, B, he replied, finishing his drink and standing. It's your decision. He paused, back to Bruce. But maybe this time you don't have to put the mission first. And with that, he was gone, leaving Bruce alone, nursing a half-drunk beer in the dying rays of a summer day, a coldness in his stomach, and a warmth spread across his ribs where his words once sat.